What's going on, guys? Right, Army Teacher in the house, and I am here with a somewhat different video for you today. This video actually came up from an idea when I was calling a friend Arvid on Discord. We were just in the ADL Discord having a chat, and we decided to think about Draft 101, if you like. What makes a good draft, what isn't a good draft, and how do I draft? And what do I think about during my drafting process? A lot of my more successful drafting campaigns, I think, has come down to my individual draft. I think drafting is one of my big strengths as a player. So let's actually talk about it, shall we? So you might get some insider tips as to how to draft more effectively. So if you are a little bit unconfident with drafting, this is what you should be looking for. So before I can talk about my actual process, I think we should talk about what makes a good draft. The first thing we should always talk about is your cores. These are pretty much the basic draft in 101. If your draft doesn't have a Fire, Water, Grass or a Fairy, Dragon, Steel core, inherently your draft is going to be weaker. This is often because these types have a lot of great synergy with each other, but it also gives you a lot of great coverage, it gives you a lot of key resistances, it does also give you some immunities, especially if you're looking at the Fairy and Steel parts of these cores. This really does give you a good basis for a draft, right? Especially if you get some good offensive and defensive parts of these, but I'll talk more about that in a second. Next thing to think about in a draft are immunities. Immunities can come from the actual typing of the Pokemon. For example, Dark is immune to Psychic, Fairy is immune to Dragon, and so on and so forth. But it's not limited to just typing. There are some abilities in the game like Water Absorb, Volt Absorb, Lightning Rod, or Storm Drain. These kind of abilities, Flash Fire, that also give you an additional immunity. This might be on a Pokemon you might want to look at. For example, my most recent GPL draft, I drafted Jellicent, which is a water type that gets the Water Absorb ability, so I have a water immunity. I have a Goodrill that has Sap Sipper, which is a grass immunity. And then I have my Rapidash with Flash Fire, which is a fire immunity. So immunities really help you out a lot because it makes you a lot stronger against certain types, and it's something that definitely gives you a much more solid basis to draft from. It makes it harder to prep for you because they have to deal with potential immunity hits. Next thing to talk about, this one changes from player to player, but I think it's really important to talk about, is entry hazards. Sticky Webs, Stealth Rocks, Spikes, and Toxic Spikes are your entry hazards that we'll be looking at mostly. Yes, I know G-Max Copperajah gets the Steel-type version of Stealth Rocks, but that's a very niche specific, so we're mainly looking at these four. I tend to not prioritize hazards as much as other players do, but having multiple rock setters, having a web setter, having spikes and toxic spikes is nice because spikes hits every grounded Pokemon, and it hits for every neutral damage. Of course, it doesn't work on flying or levitating Pokemon. Rocks hits every Pokemon for some degree of damage, but it varies dependent on the Pokemon that it's switching in on them. It is basically a rock type move, so anything that is weak to rocks it gets more damage taken, and various things like that. Webs is nice because it slows down the opponent's team, especially if your team is not particularly fast. Webs is a very good way to actually try and catch up to your opponent's speed tiers. My current GPL draft is very fast, so I expect Sticky Webs to come against me quite a lot. Which leads to the next thing to think about, which is hazard removal, which is mostly Rapid Spin and Defog. Yes, Cinderace gets Court Change, which I will talk specifically about that. Court Change isn't really removal in my opinion, it's more of a swap job, because all Court Change does is it swaps the hazards from one side of the field to the other. So for example, if Stealth Rocks are on both sides of the field, Stealth Rocks are still going to be on both sides of the field, right? Court Change does nothing. So for me, Court Change isn't really removal, it's more replacement, so I don't tend to talk about that. But Rapid Spin and Defog, it's important to know the distinction between the two. Rapid Spin will remove entry hazards from your side of the field only, Defog clears hazards off the field entirely. So that is something to bear in mind. They are key differences and they do have different roles. Rapid Spin is actually a normal type move, so ghost type Pokemon can become important to draft. We talked about immunities already. Rapid Spin is entirely blocked by ghost type, so we talk about spin blockers. Jellicent is a good example of that. So yeah. Right. And the last thing to talk about in draft is a mixture of bulk and offense. I am more of a bulky offensive player. I tend to draft decent offensive Pokemon, but I draft decent bulk to go with it. It's important to have a blend of both physical and special, of both bulk and offense. If you all in on the special attack, the opponent can just prepare specially bulky mons for you, and then you'll have a hard time breaking it. So you need that mixture, you need that blend, and it does need to synergize nicely. Hey, so that's my opinion on a good draft. I strongly advise, if you are relatively new to drafting, take a screenshot of this as you're watching this video, because this will give you a good idea of what you need. Right, so we know what a good draft looks like. Now let's actually go over my draft process, because my process is kind of important. The most common question I get asked when I'm drafting is, how much do I plan ahead of time? And the honest answer is not very much. I very rarely plan ahead of time. The only pick I really plan is my first pick, and the reason why is because your first pick in a draft should be your power pick. It should be the Pokemon you want to draft your team around. My first pick in the GPL this season was Zeraora. I wanted to draft Zeraora. If it got to me, I was actually third pick in the draft. I was amazed it didn't get picked before me. But my first pick is Zeraora, which is a phenomenal wall breaker. Hits really hard on both the physical special side, and it's blisteringly fast, and it's an electric type, which means it only has one weakness, which is ground. So, we're looking at that as our big statement pick. This pick should be coming almost every match, in my opinion. In the GPL, of course, a lot of people pick their G-Maxes, a lot of people pick their S-Tiers. Very few people opted away from that. I know DJ picked an A-Tier Pokemon, and Cool picked a C-Tier Pokemon first. Various things like that. But yeah, your first pick should be your big statement. This is the only pick that I really plan ahead of time, and I'll talk further about planning when I actually give you a bit of advice later further down the line. The next thing I prioritize are my cores. I want to complete these as fast as possible. Question Arvid mentioned yesterday, which is a good question, is if I draft a Pokemon that has two of these types, do I need to draft another one? Not really, unless they do two different jobs. So, example, if you're drafting Duraludon, which is a Dragon and Steel type Pokemon, you don't need necessarily to draft another one. You can pick up a Fairy type next pick and you've got a completed core in two Pokemon, which is great, always nice. The same is true for me with Whimsicott. I drafted Whimsicott, which is a Fairy and Grass type Pokemon, so I've got parts of two different cores set up there, which means that I can free up I can complete my cores in less than 6 picks, which is a pretty nice way to go if you can. It's not always possible, that is very worth noting. There are some people that have skipped grass in the cores in the GPL this season, although I do imagine they'll patch that up relatively soon. But yeah, speaking of patching up, the next thing is to patch up as many weaknesses. Patch up any of them if you've got them. If you have common type weaknesses, try and find an immunity or a resistance. For example, my draft team in the GPL is relatively weak to ground, so my next pick was Sigilyph, which is a ground immunity because it's a flying type. You know, things like that. If you haven't got any entry hazard setters, try and find a couple of hazard setters if you can. If you're lacking removal, pick up a spinner or a defogger. Anything like that. If you've got any common weaknesses occurring, whether it's types or entry hazards or removal, anything like that, try and patch them up with the rest of your picks. Like, if you've completed your cores in 4 picks, you've got plenty of picks to patch up any issues that you might find. So it's definitely worth thinking about patching up any weaknesses. This is your main draft process. This should be what you are doing at any point during the draft. Now, these next 3 things I'm going to say is going to be my advice on how to make a better draft, because a lot of people don't do this, and they get in quite serious trouble with it as a result. The first piece of advice is don't plan specific Pokemon. I've seen this time and time again in multiple different draft leagues that I've been in, where people have planned specific Pokemon and they complain about getting sniped. Listen to me, you are going to get sniped. Guaranteed. If you draft plan your entire draft ahead of time, all 10, 11, however many picks in a draft you get, you are going to get sniped. So the way I tend to do it instead is I plan a particular type of Pokemon, right? For example, if my draft needs a bulky water type Pokemon, then I will be looking at, okay, well, what bulky waters are available? A good example in my GPL draft, when I drafted Jellicent, was I was looking at the bulky waters in the tier that I could draft. I had taken my S tier and my A tier, so I couldn't look in those sections. So unfortunately, I couldn't get things like Gyarados or Milotic or anything like that. But I'm looking down at the waters that were available. I had Arctovish available at the time. I had Quagsire available, and I had Jellicent available. So I knew in my head by the time the pick got to me that if I had any of these picks open, there would be a good chance I would pick them. As it so happened, when I got to that point in the draft, all three of those Pokemon were available to me, so I had to make the decision as to which Pokemon I wanted, and I picked Jellicent as a result, much to Exostomp's annoyance because I sniped that from him. But you get the picture, right? And that's what you need to do. Don't plan a specific Pokemon, right? Because the more you do that, the more narrow-minded you become, and the more narrow-minded you are, the harder it is to recover a draft. So keep your eyes on that. Speaking of keeping your eyes, the next thing, keep an eye on what your opponents are doing. Okay, this is very important. I can't stress this enough, how many times I've seen people drafting for basically drafting for themselves, and then they complain about how bad their matchups are. If you keep an eye on your opponents and what your opponents are doing during the draft, as well as potentially who you might be facing, this will change your draft strategy, right? For example, for me in the GPL, by the time we got 3 or 4 picks in, everybody except me and one other coach had picked their Gigantamax Pokemon. Now, I happen to also have a bit of inside information on the other coach. I knew he didn't like Gen 8 Pokemon, so the Gigantamax Pokemon that I planned to draft, which were Orbeetle, Sandaconda, or Colossal, I knew I was going to get one of them. So I decided to not prioritize picking my G-Max form, and I started patching up the rest of my team. My Gigantamax pick was my last pick in the draft, right? So when you think about that, that's something else you can do. Another thing that happened in the recent GPL draft is it got a pick to me, and I saw that one of my opponents had Dracovish in his team, so I directly took Whimsicott away from him as he was the next pick after me. I took Whimsicott because A, it's a fairy grass type, which helps my cores in my team, so it definitely helps me out. But alongside that, it took away some power from his draft. If he had got Whimsicott Dracovish, that is a very hard core to play against, and he is in my group. So, at the time, it made sense. Now, as it so happened, Happy Nico traded the Dracovish away to Solo Destroyer for Conkeldurr, because Conkeldurr is his mascot, so that makes sense. It's fine, it's whatever. But you get the point, right? And obviously, as Dracovish was in my group, getting a Water Absorb Pokemon is always nice to absorb those Vicious Wrens. So Jellicent was my next pick as a result of that, which was part of the reason why I took Jellicent over Quagsire or Arctovish. I could have taken Arctovish as well, but I felt like Jellicent was a better option. Right, so this is the kind of thing you're looking for. Okay, so if you keep an eye on what your opponents are doing, especially the ones you're facing, but keep an eye on what's being drafted. Jellicent also came at a very good time because a lot of people still had their water types available. The picks around me had actually not taken their water types yet, so by taking my water type now, I got the water type I wanted. Right? And that's something else you can do. If you leave certain picks really late, like if you see that your opponents already have their fire types, then you don't need to draft a fire type yet, right? This is a really important strategy which will allow you to improve your draft because you will get your picks that you need more than necessarily the picks you might want, right? It's very easy to prioritize your cores, but sometimes you might not have to. Like, if nearly all of your opponents have already drafted a water type, you probably don't really need to prioritize it as much. So that's something to watch out for. The last point I have for you in this video, and the last point of advice, and this is something that I think every player should do, but they don't often. One free agency pick and unlimited player trades with other players to improve your draft. please use them, right? Take the opportunity to use them. Bear in mind, if you are trading with another player, try and make sure there's value for both players, because if you're offering something that has a lot of value to you but not a lot of value to another team, it's extremely unlikely that that trade's going to go ahead, right? For me personally, I made a mistake with my draft. I thought Excelgor got sticky webs. It turns out it actually doesn't. So I wanted webs on my team. So I had a chat with Burger, who was the new coach in, and I said, hey bro, I'd like to get G-Max Orbeetle, so if you would like G-Max Sandaconda, which is what I originally picked, you know, can we do a trade on it? Now, as it turned out, Burger didn't have a ground type, so it actually worked out perfect for him. So he got the ground type that he needed, which was G-Max Sandaconda, and I got the G-Max Orbeetle that I wanted. So that's value for both players, okay? But I've had people try and take picks from me. I've had people ask me about Jellicent and give me a type that's not useful to me. Or people have offered me trades on Whimsicott, but it leaves me without a grass type, and things like that, so it breaks my cores up, which is not something I'm particularly interested in doing. So it's a case of improving your draft over time. Now, most leagues do have free agency periods and player trades throughout the season until the final week. Feel free to use those. They will help you in the long run. It might help you improve your matchups and things like that. But don't be afraid to use them. I think it's very easy to get a little bit locked up in, this is my draft, this is what I have to go for. But don't be afraid, right? Sometimes you might have to make a change. There might be a bit of a balance issue with your team, like it's too offensive or it's too bulky and not enough offensive pressure. That's the kind of position we're looking at. So that is pretty much my guide to drafting. That is what I do in my draft process. So if you do have any questions for me regarding drafts, if there's anything else you would like to know, or if you would like my opinions on drafts or whatever, feel free to hit me up, whether it's down in the comments below or in my Discord. As always in my videos, my Discord is linked in the description. So yeah, absolutely feel free to ask. But yeah, for now, that's my guide on drafting, so I'm going to get on out of here, and thank you so much for watching. My name is Rabombi Teacher. I'm your coach of the Royal Bournemouth Rabombies. Stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.